Welcome, dear listener, to another gentle journey through the shadows of history. Tonight, we invite you to settle back, perhaps pull a soft blanket closer, and allow your mind to drift into the torchlit halls and stone corridors of medieval courts. You are safe here in your comfortable present, wrapped in the certainty of modern law and reason, as we explore a time when laughter could cost a life, and when wit was both weapon and shield. Please consider subscribing to the channel and drop a comment below. Imagine yourself walking through the heavy wooden doors of a grand castle, the scent of rushes and wood smoke filling your nostrils. The sound of your footsteps echoes against cold stone walls as you make your way toward the great hall. Here, in these chambers of power, lived figures whose very existence depended on a delicate balance between entertainment and survival. Tonight, we explore the world of the court jester, those colorful characters who danced on the razor's edge between favor and death. The jester's bells may have jingled merrily, but beneath that cheerful facade lay a profession fraught with perils that few today truly comprehend. These were not merely entertainers seeking applause, but skilled practitioners of a dangerous art form. Their painted smiles masked the constant awareness that a poorly timed joke, a misinterpreted jest, or a moment of unfortunate honesty could lead to exile, imprisonment, or worse. In the flickering candlelight of medieval courts, where power was absolute and mercy was rare, the jester occupied a unique and precarious position. They alone could speak truths that would see others hanged, yet this privilege came at a price few were willing to pay. Tonight, we shall uncover the hidden dangers of this most misunderstood profession. Let us begin this exploration in the daily world of those who lived by their wit and died by their words, in an age when laughter itself could be the most dangerous sound of all. The morning sun filters through narrow castle windows as you find yourself in the modest chamber of a court jester, somewhere in the heart of a 14th century European court. The air is thick with the scent of tallow candles and the faint mustiness of wool and linen that is known to many performances. Here, in this cramped space beneath the great hall, begins each day of a life balanced precariously between entertainment and survival. Picture yourself watching as the jester rises from his simple straw mattress, the bells on his nightcap jingling softly in the pre-dawn darkness. This is not the romanticized figure of later literature, but a real person facing real dangers with each new day. His morning ritual begins not with prayers for success, but with prayers for survival. The wooden crucifix above his bed bears witness to whispered supplications that his wit might remain sharp, his timing perfect, and his words carefully chosen. The jester's wardrobe hangs on wooden pegs driven into the stone wall, each garment a tool of his dangerous trade. The motley coat, with its patches of brilliant red, blue, and yellow, serves as both costume and armor. These bright colors were not chosen for mere decoration, but as a visual reminder to all who saw him of his unique status. The bells sewn into every seam create a constant musical accompaniment to his movements, ensuring that he could never approach unheard, never surprise, never be mistaken for anything other than what he was. As you observe him donning his distinctive cap, with its three-pointed peaks each adorned with tiny silver bells, you begin to understand the weight of this seemingly frivolous costume. Every element has been carefully calculated to maintain the delicate balance of his position. The exaggerated features of his appearance, the grotesque mask-like makeup he applies with practiced precision, serve to dehumanize him just enough that he might speak truths that would see ordinary men executed. The morning ablutions of a jester were far more complex than those of common folk. His face becomes his canvas, each line and color replied with the knowledge that his very life depends on the success of this transformation. White lead paint, despite its toxicity, creates the pale base that makes him appear otherworldly. Vermilion from ground cinnabar gives him his red lips and cheeks, while lampblack defines his exaggerated features. These cosmetics, expensive and often dangerous, were as essential to his survival as a knight's armor. You watch as he practices his facial expressions in a polished bronze mirror, testing each grimace and grin for maximum effect. His morning exercises include not just physical stretching and acrobatic preparations, but mental rehearsals of the day's potential conversations. He must memorize the current political climate, the king's recent moods, the queen's latest concerns, and the shifting alliances among the courtiers. A jester who spoke of yesterday's politics might find himself permanently silenced before noon. The tools of his trade lie scattered across a small wooden table, each item carefully maintained and constantly replaced. His lute, with its gut strings prone to snapping at crucial moments, receives his first attention. The delicate balance of tension in each string mirrors his own precarious position in court. Too loose, and the music falls flat. Too tight, and everything breaks. His juggling balls, filled with sand and sewn with precision, must be perfectly weighted. A fumbled performance before important visitors could result in more than mere embarrassment. His joke books, written in his own careful hand, represent perhaps his most dangerous possessions. These leather-bound volumes contain not just humorous stories and witty observations, but carefully coded information about court politics, noble genealogies, and the personal secrets of the powerful. Each page could serve as evidence of treason if discovered by the wrong eyes. Yet without these references, he would be unable to craft the pointed commentary that made him valuable to his patron. The breakfast that arrives at his door is simple fare, often leftovers from the previous night's feast. Bread grown hard, weak ale, perhaps some cheese beginning to show signs of age.
But even this humble meal carries risks. Jesters, by the nature of their position, made enemies among the nobility. A bitter courtier, offended by a particularly sharp jest, might easily arrange for poison to find its way into a jester's morning meal. Many jesters developed the habit of sharing their food with the castle cats, waiting to see if the animals showed signs of distress before consuming anything themselves. As the castle begins to stir with the sounds of servants and guards beginning their daily routines, our jester must prepare for his first performance of the day. This might be a private audience with his patron, where he would be expected to provide not just entertainment, but intelligence. Jesters served as unofficial spies, their lowly status allowing them to move through areas of the castle where nobles feared to tread. Kitchen servants, stable hands, and chambermaids often spoke freely in the presence of one they considered beneath their notice. The morning briefing with his patron was perhaps the most dangerous moment of any jester's day. Here, in the private chambers of power, he would be expected to report on the moods and activities of the court, to offer insights into the loyalty of various nobles, and to provide commentary on the political climate. This intelligence gathering was so valuable that many rulers considered their jesters among their most important advisors. Yet the very nature of this relationship meant that a jester possessed knowledge that could destroy reputations and end lives. You observe as he prepares small gifts and tokens for various members of the court. A miniature puppet for the king's young daughter, crafted to resemble her pet spaniel. A satirical verse about a neighboring kingdom's ambassador, written in elegant script on fine parchment. A riddle that subtly mocks a rival courtier's recent embarrassment. Each gift is calculated to maintain relationships, curry favor, or subtly convey messages that could not be spoken directly. The jester's understanding of court protocol was necessarily exhaustive.
He must know the proper forms of address for every noble, the correct procedures for approaching various members of the royal family, and the intricate rules governing precedence and ceremony. A single misstep in protocol could be interpreted as deliberate insult, providing enemies with grounds for demanding his removal or punishment. Unlike other courtiers, however, the jester's very position required him to violate these protocols regularly, making his navigation of court etiquette a constant balancing act. His morning routine also included physical preparations for the day's performances. Jesters were expected to be acrobats, musicians, storytellers, and actors all in one. Stretching exercises kept his aging joints limber enough for the tumbling and dancing expected of him. Vocal exercises prepared his throat for long hours of singing, joke-telling, and dialogue performance. His hands received special attention as juggling, lute-playing, and puppetry all demanded precise dexterity. The weapons concealed within his costume required daily maintenance as well. A small knife hidden in the sole of his shoe, designed to look like part of his exaggerated footwear. A length of silk cord woven into his belt, strong enough to serve as a garrote if necessary. These were not tools of aggression, but of last resort. A jester who found himself condemned to death might hope to choose his own manner of departure rather than face the executioner's axe. As the morning sun climbs higher and the sounds of the waking castle grow louder, our jester completes his final preparations. He reviews his mental catalog of current events, recent gossip and political developments. He practices his opening lines for the day's first performance, testing different approaches and considering various contingencies. The weight of his responsibilities settles upon his shoulders like a heavy cloak, invisible to observers but constantly present in his consciousness. The transformation is now complete. The man who rose from a simple bed has become something else entirely, a creature of bells and bright colors whose very existence depends on his ability to entertain, inform, and survive another day in the most dangerous profession of the medieval world.
As he steps from his chamber into the cold stone corridors of the castle, he carries with him the knowledge that each joke might be his last, each performance a test of his continued right to draw breath. The morning routine of a court jester was thus far more than mere preparation for entertainment. It was a careful ritual of survival, a daily transformation that turned an ordinary man into a living paradox, valued and despised, protected and vulnerable, wise and foolish all at once. In this liminal space between safety and danger, between truth and performance, the jester would spend his days walking a tightrope sprung over the abyss of royal displeasure. As our jester emerges from his private chambers and steps into the bustling life of the castle, you find yourself following him through corridors alive with whispered conversations and meaningful glances. The great hall stretches before you like a stage set for an elaborate play, its high vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows that seem to hold secrets of their own. Here, beneath the watchful eyes of painted ancestors and flickering torches, the most dangerous performances of medieval Europe would unfold each day. The morning light streaming through tall, narrow windows illuminates a scene of carefully orchestrated chaos. Servants hurry past carrying silver platters and ewers of wine, their faces masks of studied neutrality. Pages in bright livery dart between the massive oak tables like colorful birds, delivering messages whose contents could topple kingdoms or elevate peasants to positions of power. The air itself seems thick with intrigue, heavy with the weight of unspoken alliances and simmering resentments that define life in these halls of power. Imagine yourself observing as our jester makes his first entrance of the day, his bells announcing his presence with a cheerful melody that belies the tension that immediately ripples through the assembled courtiers. Every conversation pauses for just a moment. Every eye turns to assess his mood, his costume, the subtle signals that might indicate what kind of performance they can expect today.
For these nobles understand what history has often forgotten, that the jester's words carry weight far beyond their apparent frivolity. The morning's first challenge comes in the form of Lord Aldrich, a minor baron whose ambitions far exceed his intelligence. His florid face, already bearing the telltale signs of early morning wine consumption, turns toward the jester with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. The previous week, the jester had crafted a particularly cutting verse about lords who mistake volume for wisdom, and though no names were mentioned, every person in the hall had understood the reference. Now Aldrich seeks either revenge or reconciliation, and the jester must navigate this encounter without creating a permanent enemy who might whisper poison into royal ears. Watch as the jester approaches with calculated humility, his exaggerated bow drawing chuckles from the assembled courtiers. His opening gambit is a self-deprecating joke about his own appearance, deflecting attention from Aldrich's wounded pride while simultaneously establishing his role as the court's designated fool. Yet beneath this apparent submission lies a subtle threat, a reminder that the jester's position grants him certain protections that even nobles must respect. The dance begins, each word carefully weighed, each gesture precisely calculated to maintain the delicate balance of power that keeps all parties breathing freely. The breakfast performance that follows demonstrates the extraordinary skill required to survive as a professional fool. The jester must entertain 3 distinct audiences simultaneously: the royal family, whose favor ensures his continued existence, the noble courtiers, whose enmity could prove fatal, and the servants and guards, whose gossip forms the intelligence network that keeps him valuable to his patrons. Each group expects different kinds of humor, responds to different kinds of wit, and poses unique dangers to his well-being. For the young prince, aged perhaps 12 and eager for diversion from his morning lessons, the jester produces a series of physical comedies involving juggling, tumbling, and elaborate pratfalls.
These seemingly simple entertainments require years of training to execute safely. and even a minor injury sustained during performance could be interpreted as an omen of coming disaster. Court astrologers and religious advisors watch such displays with suspicious eyes, ready to declare any mishap a sign of divine displeasure with the realm's leadership. The Queen Mother, a woman whose steel will is hidden beneath layers of silk and ceremony, prefers more sophisticated entertainment. For her, the jester crafts elaborate riddles that comment obliquely on court politics, weaving together references to classical literature, Christian theology, and contemporary events in ways that demonstrate his education while never directly challenging established authority. These performances are perhaps the most dangerous of all, as they require the jester to display intelligence that some nobles might find threatening, while maintaining the pretense of foolishness that protects him from accusations of sedition. You observe the careful choreography of morning court interactions, noting how the jester's presence affects the behavior of everyone around him. Conversations that began in hushed, conspiratorial tones shift to louder, more innocent topics when he approaches. Documents are subtly shuffled or concealed, not because the jester cannot read, but because everyone knows he can read very well indeed. His ability to appear at unexpected moments, to overhear conversations that participants believed private, makes him a walking repository of secrets that could destroy reputations and end lives. The diplomatic challenges of the jester's morning routine extend beyond mere entertainment. When the Flemish ambassador arrives with his retinue, seeking to renegotiate trade agreements that have grown unfavorable to his merchants, the jester must walk an even finer line. His performance must be entertaining enough to create a festive atmosphere conducive to negotiation, while avoiding any humor that might be interpreted as commentary on Flemish customs, politics, or religion. A careless joke about wool merchants or beer brewing could derail months of delicate diplomatic preparation. Consider the extraordinary memory skills required for this profession. The jester must recall not only hundreds of jokes, songs, and stories, but also the complex web of relationships that define court life.
He must remember who is allied with whom, who has recently fallen from favor, whose children are being considered for advantageous marriages, and whose debts have grown beyond their ability to repay. This information shapes every performance, determines which jokes are safe and which are potentially suicidal, and provides the intelligence that makes him valuable to his royal patrons. The morning meal itself presents unique hazards for a court jester. Seated at the lowest table, far from the salt that marks the division between noble and common, he must nevertheless remain alert to everything happening throughout the great hall. His position allows him to observe the subtle signals that pass between conspirators, to note which servants seem nervous or excited, to identify visitors whose presence might indicate important developments. Yet this same visibility makes him vulnerable to those who would prefer their activities to go unobserved. The tools of his trade must be constantly maintained and carefully concealed throughout his daily interactions. His juggling equipment doubles as potential weapons, weighted balls can become projectiles, bell and sticks transform into clubs, and silk scarves hide thin wires that could serve more sinister purposes. His musical instruments contain hidden compartments for storing messages, small valuables, or emergency supplies of gold that might purchase freedom if his position becomes untenable. Even his costume serves defensive purposes, its bright colors and jingling bells making it impossible for him to move unnoticed, thereby protecting him from accusations of sneaking about on missions of espionage or assassination. The social dynamics of the morning court session reveal the complex ways in which jesters navigated class boundaries that were otherwise rigid and unchangeable. While ostensibly occupying the lowest social position, jesters possessed a form of cultural capital that allowed them to interact with royalty in ways forbidden to even high-ranking nobles. This privilege came at the cost of being perpetually vulnerable to the changing moods and political needs of their patrons. A joke that earned laughter and rewards on Tuesday might result in exile or execution on Wednesday, depending on how the political winds had shifted overnight.
Religious observances provided another minefield for the practicing jester. Morning prayers were mandatory for all court members, but the jester's participation required careful calibration. Too much piety might make him seem sanctimonious and unfit for his role as court fool. Too little devotion could result in accusations of heresy, apostasy, or allegiance to foreign powers. The jester must appear sufficiently religious to avoid suspicion while maintaining the slight air of irreverence that made his position credible. This balance became even more precarious during periods periods of religious tension, when accusations of insufficient orthodoxy could provide convenient pretexts for eliminating troublesome individuals. The morning's performances also served as a form of political theater, allowing rulers to communicate messages to their subjects without the appearance of direct command. When the jester mocked excessive pride, observant courtiers understood that their king disapproved of recent displays of arrogance among his nobles. When his jokes targeted corruption or incompetence, those guilty of such failings recognized warnings to reform their behavior before more direct consequences followed. This indirect communication system allowed rulers to maintain plausible deniability while ensuring their displeasure was clearly understood. The physical demands of morning performances took their toll on aging jesters, yet showing signs of weakness or infirmity could be fatal to their careers. Court life valued youth, beauty, and vigor. A jester who could no longer tumble convincingly or sing with clear voice might find himself replaced by a younger competitor. The profession offered no retirement benefits, no pension for long service, and no guarantee of care in old age. Many jesters developed elaborate strategies for concealing physical decline, using makeup to hide the effects of aging, learning new skills to replace those diminished by time, and cultivating networks of allies who might protect them when their performance abilities began to fail. The morning routine also included careful observation of the subtle signs that indicated changing political fortunes within the court. A nobleman who had previously occupied a prominent position at the high table, but now found himself seated further from the royal presence, had clearly fallen from favor.
New faces among the courtiers might indicate the rise of previously unknown families or the arrival of foreign agents seeking to influence royal policy. Changes in the order of precedence, modifications to the ceremonial protocols, or alterations in the decoration of the Great Hall all carried meaning that a skilled jester must interpret correctly to avoid backing the wrong faction in ongoing political struggles. By midday, as the morning's formal entertainment concluded and courtiers began to disperse to their various duties, our jester had successfully navigated the first major challenge of his day. He had entertained without offending, informed without revealing his sources, and maintained the delicate balance that kept him valuable to his patrons while not becoming so threatening as to invite elimination. The afternoon would bring new challenges, different audiences, and fresh opportunities for the kind of mistake that could end not just his career, but his life itself. As you follow him from the Great Hall into the castle's winding corridors, the weight of his impossible position settles around you like a heavy cloak, making you acutely aware of just how precarious existence could be for those who lived by their wit in an age when wit itself was often considered a dangerous weapon. As the afternoon sun begins its descent toward the western horizon, you find yourself following our weary jester through the quieter corridors of the castle, away from the grand performances and public spectacles that have defined its day. The flickering torchlight casts dancing shadows on stone walls as he makes his way toward the private quarters, where the real work of a courtful takes place. Here, in chambers where few are permitted to enter, the most dangerous conversations of medieval court life unfold behind heavy wooden doors and beneath the weight of absolute secrecy. The transition from public performer to private confidant requires its own form of theatrical transformation. As you observe, the jester's posture subtly shifts, his exaggerated gestures become more controlled, and the manic energy of his public persona gives way to a quieter, more focused intensity. The bells that announced his every movement in the Great Hall are carefully muffled with strips of cloth, allowing him to move through the castle's private areas with something approaching stealth. This is the jester as spy, as advisor, as keeper of secrets that could topple kingdoms if spoken in the wrong ears. The first private audience of the evening takes place in the solar of Lady Margaret, the king's eldest sister, and a woman whose political acumen rivals that of any male courtier. Her chamber is a study in calculated comfort, its tapestries depicting scenes of courtly love that mask the harder realities of political alliance and strategic marriage. The air is scented with lavender and rosewater, luxury items that speak to her high status while serving the practical purpose of masking the less pleasant odors that permeate even the finest medieval residences. Lady Margaret does not require entertainment in the traditional sense. Instead, she seeks information, analysis, and the kind of frank assessment that only a jester can provide without fear of being accused of treason. As you listen to their conversation, you begin to understand the true value of the jester's position. His lowly status makes him invisible to most courtiers, allowing him to observe behaviors and overhear conversations that would be carefully guarded in the presence of acknowledged equals. His apparent foolishness provides cover for intelligence gathering that would be impossible for a recognized spy or advisor. The intelligence briefing that unfolds in Lady Margaret's Solar reveals the sophisticated network of information gathering that successful jesters maintained throughout the medieval world. Kitchen servants, eager to curry favor with someone they perceive as harmless, share gossip about which nobles are eating poorly due to financial constraints. Stables hands report on the condition of various lords' horses and equipment, providing insights into their military preparedness and economic status. Chambermaids discuss the contents of private correspondence they have glimpsed to a cleaning, offering fragments of intelligence about diplomatic initiatives and personal relationships. Consider the extraordinary position this places our jester in as he reports his findings to Lady Margaret.
He must reveal enough information to maintain his value as an intelligence asset, while carefully concealing the methods by which he obtains sensitive details. Too much specificity about his sources could endanger the servants and common folk who trust him, while too little detail would make his reports useless to his noble patrons. The balancing act extends beyond mere discretion to encompass questions of loyalty and survival that would challenge even the most skilled modern intelligence operative. The conversation turns to more dangerous topics as Lady Margaret seeks the jester's assessment of various courtiers' loyalty to the crown. This is perhaps the most treacherous ground a medieval jester could navigate, as accusations of disloyalty, even when accurate, could backfire catastrophically if they reached the wrong ears. The jester must provide honest analysis based on his observations, while ensuring that his words cannot be used as evidence against him should political fortunes change. His responses are therefore coded in layers of metaphor and allegory that allow multiple interpretations depending on future circumstances. As the evening progresses, you follow the jester to his next private appointment, this time in the chambers of Father Benedict, the royal chaplain, whose influence extends beyond matters of religion. The priest's quarters reflect his dual role as spiritual advisor and political counselor, its shelves lined with theological treatises alongside works on law, diplomacy, and statecraft. Here, the conversation focuses on the moral implications of various royal policies and the potential religious consequences of political decisions. The relationship between jester and chaplain illustrates one of the most complex dynamics in medieval court life. Both men occupy positions that grant them unusual access to powerful figures, yet both remain vulnerable to the changing whims of their patrons. The chaplain's spiritual authority provides some protection against royal displeasure, but history is littered with religious figures who fell from grace when their counsel became inconvenient. The jester's protection is even more tenuous, dependent entirely on his ability to remain useful and entertaining without becoming threatening.
Their discussion ranges across topics that would be considered treasonous if overheard by the wrong individuals. The chaplain seeks the jester's assessment of popular sentiment regarding recent tax increases, information crucial for determining whether religious sermons should emphasize obedience to earthly authority or focus on spiritual matters that avoid potential controversy. The jester, in turn, seeks guidance on how to craft performances that address social issues without appearing to criticize royal policy directly. The evening's most dangerous appointment takes place in the king's private study, a chamber that few living souls have ever entered. The room itself seems to whisper of power and paranoia, its walls lined with maps showing the boundaries of contested territories, and shelves holding correspondence from foreign courts that could reshape the political landscape of Europe. Here, in this most sacred of spaces, the jester must transform once again, this time becoming not entertainer or spy, but something approaching a trusted advisor whose counsel could influence decisions affecting thousands of lives. The conversation that unfolds between king and jester reveals the extraordinary intimacy that could develop between ruler and fool in the medieval world. The king speaks freely of his fears, his doubts, and his concerns about potential threats to his reign. He seeks not just information, but perspective, the kind of honest assessment that courtiers trained in flattery and self-preservation cannot provide. The jester becomes a sounding board for royal anxieties, a confidant whose lowly status paradoxically makes him the most trustworthy person in the entire kingdom.
Yet this intimacy carries its own deadly perils. The jester who becomes too close to his royal patron risks being perceived as having gained dangerous influence over royal decision-making. Ambitious courtiers who find their own access to the king limited by the jester's presence may begin to view him as an obstacle to be eliminated rather than a harmless entertainer. The history of medieval courts is filled with tales of jesters who grew too powerful and subsequently found themselves facing accusations of witchcraft, heresy, or treason as their enemies sought pretext for their destruction.
The king's questions this evening focus on the loyalty of his brother, Duke Robert, whose recent activities have caused concern among the royal council. The Duke has been making extended visits to his estates near the French border, ostensibly to oversee agricultural improvements, but possibly to conduct secret negotiations with foreign agents. The jester must provide analysis of the Duke's motivations and intentions based on behavioral observations and overheard conversations, yet he must do so without appearing to encourage fratricidal conflict or seeming to benefit from potential royal family discord. The evening's final ritual takes place in the privacy of his own chamber, where the day's accumulated tensions can finally be released. Here, with the door barred against intrusion and the windows covered to prevent observation, the jester can allow his carefully maintained facade to crack slightly. The process of removing his makeup becomes almost ceremonial, each layer of paint and powder representing another aspect of the persona that protects him from the world's dangers. The silence that settles over his chamber as sleep finally claims him is not the peaceful quiet of rest well earned, but the temporary respite of a condemned man granted one more day of reprieve. Tomorrow will bring new audiences, fresh challenges, and additional opportunities for the kind of mistake that could end not just his career, but his life itself. In this medieval world of absolute power and arbitrary justice, the court jester's existence represents perhaps the most precarious form of employment ever devised, where wit serves as both weapon and shield against the ever-present threat of royal displeasure. In the autumn of 1347, as the Black Death began its merciless march across Europe, a young monk named Thomas of Whitmore made a decision that would transform him from a servant of God into one of the most celebrated and ultimately doomed court jesters in English history. His story illuminates not just the personal journey of one remarkable individual, but the broader currents of fear, desperation, and opportunity that shaped an entire continent during one of its darkest periods. Picture yourself standing in the scriptorium of Whitmore Abbey, a Benedictine monastery nestled in the rolling hills of Yorkshire, where the scent of parchment and ink mingles with the prayers of men who believe their devotion can hold back the tide of death sweeping across Christendom. Here, among the carefully illuminated manuscripts and the quiet scratch of quill pens against vellum, young Brother Thomas pursues his assigned duties with a diligence that masks a restless spirit, increasingly drawn to worldly concerns beyond the monastery's walls. Thomas possessed gifts that set him apart from his fellow monks even before fate forced him to leave the cloister. His memory was extraordinary, capable of retaining vast quantities of scripture, classical literature, and contemporary writing with perfect accuracy. His voice, trained in the complex harmonies of Gregorian chant, could shift effortlessly from solemn devotion to lighter melodies that brought unexpected joy to the abbey's austere atmosphere. Most dangerously of all, he possessed a wit sharp enough to find humor in the most sacred texts, a talent that both delighted and disturbed his superiors. The first signs of Thomas's future profession emerged during the abbey's informal gatherings, when tired monks would gather in the warming room after long hours of prayer and manual labor. His ability to mimic the mannerisms of various abbey officials, from the pompous brother treasurer to the perpetually anxious brother cellarer, earned him both laughter and occasional reprimands. These early performances revealed an intuitive understanding of human nature that would serve him well in the treacherous world of court politics, though he could not have imagined such a future from within the monastery's protective walls. The transformation began when news of the plague's approach reached the abbey through traveling merchants and fleeing refugees. Brother Thomas found himself assigned to tend the sick and dying who sought sanctuary within the monastery's walls,
a duty that brought him face to face with suffering on a scale that challenged even his strong faith.
The traditional consolations of religion seemed inadequate in the face of such overwhelming mortality, and Thomas began to develop a different approach to comforting the afflicted, one that relied more on distraction and gentle humor than on promises of eternal reward. His unconventional methods earned him both criticism and gratitude. While some of his fellow monks viewed his attempts to entertain the dying as inappropriate levity in the face of divine judgment, the refugees and plague victims themselves responded with pathetic eagerness to anything that could momentarily lift their spirits above their desperate circumstances. Thomas discovered that a well-timed joke or an amusing story could provide more immediate comfort than lengthy theological discourses, a realization that planted the seeds of doubt about his religious vocation. The crisis that forced Thomas from monastic life arrived with the autumn rains of 1347, when the plague finally reached Yorkshire with all its terrible inevitability. The abbey, despite its attempts at isolation, could not remain immune to the pestilence that was transforming the known world. Brother after brother fell victim to the disease, their bodies racked with fever and covered with the dark swellings that gave the plague its ominous name. The carefully ordered life of prayer and contemplation collapsed into chaos as the living struggled simply to bury the dead with minimal dignity. Thomas himself contracted the plague but survived, though the experience left him profoundly changed. During the delirium of fever, he experienced visions that seemed to mock the certainties of his religious training. He saw angels juggling human skulls while laughing at the prayers of the dying, and devils who spoke with the voices of abbots delivering sermons on the vanity of earthly existence. These hallucinations, products of disease and psychological trauma, shattered his faith in the absolute truth that had guided his early life and left him questioning everything he had previously accepted without doubt. Recovery brought with it a terrible freedom. The abbey had lost more than half its population, including the abbot and most of the senior officials who had structured Thomas's daily existence. The survivors faced an impossible choice between maintaining their religious vocation in a decimated community or abandoning their vows to seek security elsewhere. For Thomas, the decision was complicated by his growing conviction that God, if he existed at all, possessed a sense of humor far darker than anything the church was willing to acknowledge. The formal release from his vows required Thomas to undergo a ceremony that was part legal proceeding and part exorcism, designed to sever his spiritual connections to the monastery while protecting both parties from accusations of impiety. Standing before the altar where he had once sworn eternal devotion to God, Thomas renounced his religious calling in words carefully crafted to avoid outright blasphemy while making his rejection of monastic life legally binding. The ritual concluded with his symbolic transformation from Brother Thomas into Thomas the Fool, marked by the exchange of his monk's robes for the parti-colored garments that would define his new identity. The psychological impact of this transformation cannot be understated. Thomas had spent his formative years within a system that provided absolute certainty about right and wrong, salvation and damnation, proper behavior and sinful conduct. His new role as a professional fool required him to embrace uncertainty, to find truth in paradox, and to speak wisdom through apparent folly. The adjustment period was marked by periods of depression and self-doubt as he struggled to reconcile his religious training with the moral ambiguities of secular life. His early performances for Sir Geoffrey's household revealed both his natural talents and the steep learning curve he faced in adapting monastic skills to worldly entertainment. His extensive knowledge of Scripture proved unexpectedly valuable, as he could craft religious parodies that delighted audiences familiar with the source material, while carefully avoiding outright heresy that might bring unwanted attention from church authorities. His training in rhetoric allowed him to construct elaborate verbal edifices that appeared to support conventional wisdom while subtly undermining the foundations of accepted belief.
Traveling with Sir Geoffrey's entourage, he observed the breakdown of social order that followed in the plague's wake. Traditional hierarchies had collapsed as death claimed nobles and peasants with equal indifference, creating opportunities for ambitious commoners while threatening the foundations of feudal society. Thomas learned to read the subtle signs of political upheaval, skills that would prove essential for survival in the even more dangerous environment of the royal court.
His performances during this period evolved rapidly as he experimented with different approaches to entertaining audiences facing unprecedented social trauma. He developed a repertoire of plague jokes that helped people process their fears through laughter, though he learned to gauge his audiences carefully, as humor that relieved tension for some could provoke violent anger in others still raw from personal losses. These early mistakes taught him the fundamental lesson of his new profession, that the line between entertainment and offense could shift without warning, making constant vigilance essential for survival. The approach to London provided Thomas with his first glimpse of the world he was about to enter. The capital, though reduced by plague and war, remained the center of English political life, its streets alive with courtiers, merchants, diplomats, and the countless hangers-on who fed off the scraps of royal favor. The very air seemed charged with ambition and desperation, as survivors of the Great Mortality sought to rebuild their fortunes in a world where traditional certainties no longer applied. As we follow Thomas through these early stages of his transformation from monk to fool, we see reflected the broader social upheavals that characterized mid-14th century Europe. The plague had shattered traditional social structures, while creating opportunities for those bold or desperate enough to seize them. Thomas's journey from religious devotion to secular entertainment paralleled the experiences of countless others who found their old certainties destroyed and were forced to reinvent themselves in a world that no longer resembled the one into which they had been born.
The winter of 1348 marked the beginning of what history would remember as the golden age of Thomas the Fool's career, though even at its peak, his position remained as precarious as morning frost on a blade of grass. King Edward III, struggling to maintain morale in a realm devastated by plague and military setbacks, had taken an unprecedented step in elevating a former monk to the position of principal court jester. This appointment, announced during the Feast of St. Stephen, would transform Thomas from a provincial entertainer into one of the most influential figures in medieval England, though few at court understood the true extent of his growing power. Picture yourself standing in the great hall of Westminster Palace on that December evening, watching as Thomas receives the golden bells that mark his elevation to royal service. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of symbolic complexity, designed to simultaneously honor his talents while emphasizing his fundamental servitude to the crown. King Edward, resplendent in ermine and cloth of gold, personally fastened the jester's bells to Thomas's new motley coat, each ring of precious metal representing both privilege and bondage. The assembled nobility watched in fascination as their sovereign invested a former monk with symbols of office that carried more practical authority than many official court positions. The irony of Thomas's situation became apparent almost immediately. His lowly official status as a fool granted him access to private royal chambers where earls and dukes were forbidden to enter. His supposed simplicity allowed him to ask questions that would be treasonous coming from acknowledged advisors. His role as entertainer provided perfect cover for intelligence-gathering activities that would have resulted in execution if discovered in anyone else. Within weeks of his appointment, Thomas had become the king's most trusted confidant, though this intimacy would ultimately prove more curse than blessing.
Each morning began with private consultation in the king's chamber, where state business was discussed with a frankness that would have shocked those who believed Edward III governed through formal council meetings. Thomas found himself privy to military strategy sessions, diplomatic negotiations, and financial planning that shaped the destiny of the English realm. His advice, sought initially as entertainment, gradually became essential to royal decision-making. Consider the morning in February 1349, when Thomas helped King Edward navigate the crisis surrounding the siege of Calais. French resistance had proven far stronger than anticipated. English finances were stretched to the breaking point, and noble support for the war was beginning to waver. The formal council had reached an impasse, with military advisors demanding reinforcement, while financial officers insisted that the realm could not afford continued operations. Into this deadlock stepped Thomas, whose unique position allowed him to propose solutions that transcended traditional factional boundaries. His suggestion, presented in the form of an elaborate allegory about a farmer trying to harvest grain during a drought, proposed a strategy that combined tactical withdrawal with diplomatic offensive. Rather than reinforcing the siege with expensive troops, Thomas recommended that Edward use the respite to negotiate with Flemish merchants who could provide financial support in exchange for favorable trade agreements after victory. This approach, which formal advisors might have dismissed as beneath their dignity, ultimately proved decisive in securing Calais while preserving English treasury reserves for future campaigns. The success of this intervention established a pattern that would define Thomas's career throughout his golden years. Complex political problems were presented to him as entertainment challenges, allowing him to propose radical solutions without the formal responsibility that attached to official advisors. His recommendations, filtered through layers of allegory and humor, could be adopted if successful or dismissed as foolish jest if they proved impractical. This arrangement provided King Edward with invaluable flexibility while protecting Thomas from the direct consequences of policy failures. The reports that Thomas compiled from these journeys provided King Edward with unprecedented insight into the true state of his realm.
Unlike formal government channels, which filtered information through layers of bureaucracy and self-interest, Thomas's intelligence came directly from the sources most affected by royal policy. His network included tavern keepers who overheard merchant conversations, parish priests who knew the intimate details of local politics, and traveling craftsmen whose work took them throughout the kingdom. This information proved invaluable for royal decision-making, but its very accuracy made it dangerous to those whose incompetence or corruption it revealed. The case of Lord Pembroke illustrates both the value and the danger of Thomas's intelligence gathering. Reports from the Welsh borderlands suggested that Pembroke was systematically embezzling funds intended for castle maintenance, leaving English fortifications vulnerable to Welsh raids. Traditional investigation methods would have required months of formal inquiry, during which Pembroke could have concealed evidence and prepared defenses. Thomas's network provided detailed documentation of the embezzlement within weeks, allowing King Edward to remove Pembroke before significant damage occurred. Yet this success created a permanent enemy, whose resentment would later prove fatal to Thomas's career. Pembroke, stripped of his offices and facing financial ruin, understood exactly who had been responsible for his downfall. His subsequent efforts to gather damaging information about Thomas demonstrated the reciprocal nature of medieval intelligence networks. Those who lived by information gathering were particularly vulnerable to having their own secrets exposed by those they had previously investigated. The summer of 1350 marked the absolute peak of Thomas's influence when King Edward formally appointed him to the newly created position of Royal Counselor for Special Affairs. This unprecedented step, which granted a Jester official advisory status, represented both the culmination of Thomas's rise and the beginning of his downfall. The appointment announcement, delivered during a grand feast celebrating English victory at the naval battle of Winchelsea, shocked the assembled nobility and provided his enemies with concrete evidence of his dangerous elevation above his proper station. The ceremony itself was designed to emphasize both Thomas's achievement and his continued subordination to royal authority.
He received a chain of office bearing the royal arms, but it was fashioned from silver rather than the gold traditionally reserved for noble counselors. His new title granted him precedence over most court officials during formal ceremonies, but he remained excluded from hereditary noble privileges that defined the highest ranks of medieval society. These careful distinctions satisfied King Edward's desire to honor his favorite while providing some protection against accusations of revolutionary social change. The practical effects of Thomas's elevation were immediately apparent in the conduct of royal business. Council meetings that had previously excluded non-noble participants now included a former monk whose opinions carried significant weight in royal decision-making.
Diplomatic negotiations incorporated strategies developed by someone whose understanding of human nature had been shaped by religious study rather than aristocratic training. Military planning benefited from insights provided by an advisor whose travel throughout the realm had given him detailed knowledge of local conditions and popular sentiment. King Edward's response to this challenge would determine not only Thomas's future, but the broader question of whether royal authority could transcend traditional social boundaries. The decision that emerged from weeks of private consultation between King and Jester represented a compromise that satisfied no one while intensifying the conflicts that would ultimately prove fatal to Thomas's career. As you observe the chess match unfolding in the corridors of Westminster Palace, you begin to understand that the golden years of Thomas the Fool's influence were drawing to a close, though neither he nor his royal patron yet fully comprehended the forces that would soon conspire to destroy them both. The autumn of 1351 arrived at Westminster like a harbinger of doom, its golden leaves falling like tears upon the stone courtyards where Thomas the Fool had once danced before applauding audiences. The changing season brought with it a transformation in the political climate that even his keen intelligence had failed to anticipate fully.
What began as isolated opposition to his influence had crystallized into a coordinated campaign of destruction that would test the very foundations of royal authority, while demonstrating the ultimate fragility of a jester's protection in the medieval world. Picture yourself standing in the shadows of the Great Hall as Thomas delivers what would unknowingly become his final performance before the assembled court. The surface gaiety of the occasion, a celebration of the Feast of St. Michael, masked undercurrents of tension that made the very air seem thick with unspoken threats. The traditional autumn festivities proceeded according to ancient custom, but every laugh felt forced, every smile carried hints of malice, and every gesture of goodwill concealed daggers of political calculation that would soon draw blood. Yet what Thomas intended as universal entertainment was received by his enemies as a specific attack on their legitimacy. The Duke of Lancaster saw in the portrayal of nobles as merchants a direct reference to his own recent involvement in wool trading ventures. The Earl of Warwick interpreted the depiction of false wisdom as a personal insult to his intellectual pretensions. Lord Pembroke viewed the entire performance as an elaborate mockery of his recent disgrace and financial ruin. These interpretations, whether accurate or not, provided the emotional fuel necessary to transform political opposition into personal vendetta. The immediate aftermath of the performance revealed the sophisticated nature of the conspiracy that had been building against Thomas throughout the summer months. Within hours of the conclusion of his show, carefully coordinated accusations began emerging from multiple sources, each designed to support and reinforce the others in ways that suggested expensive planning and preparation. The timing was no coincidence. His enemies had waited for Thomas to achieve maximum visibility before launching their assault, ensuring that his fall would be as public and humiliating as his rise had been spectacular. The first accusation came from Brother Benedict, the former chaplain of Whitmore Abbey, who arrived at court bearing documents that allegedly proved Thomas's release from monastic vows had been improperly obtained.
According to Benedict's testimony, Thomas had concealed his true motivations for leaving religious life, claiming medical necessity, while actually planning his secular career from the beginning. This deception, if proven, would render his subsequent activities invalid and potentially subject him to charges of fraud, apostasy, and violation of sacred oaths. The legal complexities surrounding monastic vows in the aftermath of the plague provided fertile ground for such accusations. The unprecedented mortality among religious communities had forced church authorities to develop new procedures for releasing monks from their obligations, but these emergency measures lacked the detailed precedents that governed normal ecclesiastical law. Thomas's enemies had identified ambiguities in the documentation of his release that could be exploited by clever lawyers to cast doubt on the legitimacy of his entire career transformation. Simultaneously with the religious accusations, Master Geoffrey Chaucer the Elder presented evidence suggesting that Thomas had engaged in systematic corruption during his investigations of merchant activities. According to these charges, the former monk had demanded bribes from traders in exchange for favorable treatment in his reports, while accepting gifts from competitors seeking to eliminate business rivals through false accusations of misconduct. The documentation presented to support these claims included forged letters and fabricated witness statements, but their very existence forced King Edward to order formal investigation into his favorite's conduct. The third prong of the assault involved accusations of seditious activity, presented by Lord Pembroke with support from several minor nobles whose territories bordered Scotland and Wales. These charges alleged that Thomas had used his intelligence network not merely to gather information for royal use, but to maintain communications with enemies of the English crown. Specific claims included secret correspondence with Scottish agents, suspicious meetings with Welsh dissidents, and the transmission of military intelligence to French sympathizers operating within English territories. The cumulative effect of these accusations was devastating to Thomas's position, not because of their individual validity, but because of their coordinated nature and careful timing. Each charge seemed to confirm and strengthen the others, creating a pattern of misconduct that appeared too extensive to be coincidental.
The sheer volume of allegations made detailed refutation impossible within the compressed time frame that court politics demanded, while the coordination between accusers suggested a level of guilt that independent investigations might never have implied. King Edward's response to the crisis revealed both his personal affection for Thomas and his fundamental understanding of royal political necessities. The private consultation that took place in the king's chamber on the evening following the accusations represented one of the most poignant moments in medieval court history, as sovereign and servant faced the reality that their relationship had become a liability that threatened to damage royal authority itself. The conversation, reconstructed from testimony given years later during papal investigations, illuminated the tragic impossibility of Thomas's position. The evidence presented during these hearings revealed the extraordinary lengths to which Thomas's enemies had gone to ensure his destruction. Forged documents had been planted in his personal possessions and later discovered during official searches. Servants had been bribed or threatened into providing testimony that supported specific accusations. Financial records had been altered to suggest patterns of corruption that existed only in the imaginations of his accusers. The conspiracy's sophistication demonstrated both the resources his enemies could command and the intensity of their determination to eliminate him permanently. Yet, even as the legal proceedings moved inexorably toward their predetermined conclusion, Thomas continued to demonstrate the intellectual gifts that had originally brought him to royal attention. His responses to specific accusations were masterful exercises in logical analysis that systematically exposed the contradictions and impossibilities embedded in his enemies' charges. His knowledge of church law revealed the procedural flaws in Brother Benedict's accusations regarding his monastic release. His understanding of commercial practices demolished Master Chaucer's allegations of mercantile corruption. His detailed knowledge of border conditions made Lord Pembroke's claims of seditious communications appear ridiculous to anyone familiar with actual circumstances in contested territories. The tragic irony of Thomas's defense was that its very competence worked against him by confirming his enemies' assertions that he possessed dangerous capabilities that exceeded appropriate bounds for someone of his humble origins. Each demonstration of his analytical skills reinforced noble claims that he had exceeded his proper station. Each display of his extensive knowledge provided additional evidence that he had gained access to information and authority that threatened traditional hierarchical relationships. His intelligence, which had once been his greatest asset, became the primary argument for his elimination. The verdict, announced during the Feast of St. Andrew, represented a compromise that satisfied the political needs of all parties while destroying Thomas as completely as his enemies could have desired. The tribunal found him guilty of procedural violations in obtaining his release from monastic vows, but cleared him of the more serious charges of apostasy and fraud. He was convicted of accepting gifts from merchants while conducting official investigations, but exonerated of deliberate corruption or systematic bribery. Most significantly, he was found guilty of maintaining unauthorized communications with foreign agents, though the evidence suggested incompetence rather than treason. The historical significance of Thomas's fall extended far beyond the personal tragedy of one unusually talented individual. His destruction marked the end of an unprecedented experiment in social mobility that had briefly challenged the fundamental assumptions of medieval hierarchical society.
Future monarchs would remember the lesson of his career, that elevating commoners to positions of real authority, regardless of their talents, created instabilities that could threaten dynastic survival. The position of court jester would continue to exist, but never again would it carry the political influence that Thomas had briefly wielded. As you follow his solitary figure disappearing into the London fog, you understand that you have witnessed more than the fall of a single ambitious man. Thomas's career and destruction illuminated the fundamental tensions between merit and birth, talent and tradition that would continue to shape European society for centuries to come. His brief moment of influence represented a glimpse of possibilities that medieval society was not yet prepared to embrace, while his ultimate fate demonstrated the price that awaited those who challenged established order before their world was ready for such change. In the summer of 1923, Professor Reginald Whitmore, a Cambridge archaeologist whose passion for medieval history had led him to excavate forgotten castle sites across the English countryside, made a discovery that would fundamentally alter our understanding of court jester culture and reveal mysteries that remain unsolved to this day. Working in the ruins of Thornfield Castle, a once magnificent fortress that had housed the court of the Earl of Blackmore during the late 14th century, Whitmore uncovered evidence of what appeared to be a secret society of jesters whose activities extended far beyond mere entertainment into realms of knowledge preservation, political resistance, and possibly even supernatural practices that challenge conventional historical assumptions. Picture yourself standing beside Professor Whitmore in the castle's partially collapsed Great Hall, where centuries of neglect have reduced elaborate stone carvings to weathered fragments and allowed ivy to claim victory over human ambition. The July sunshine streaming through empty window frames illuminates dust motes dancing in the air like ghosts of long-dead courtiers, while the professor's careful excavation techniques slowly reveal artifacts that speak of lives lived in shadow and secrecy. Here, beneath layers of accumulated debris and forgotten time, lay evidence of a hidden world that existed parallel to the documented history of medieval entertainment. The first hint of something extraordinary came with the discovery of a sealed chamber behind what had once been the castle's main fireplace. The entrance, concealed by clever masonry work that had survived the centuries intact, could only be accessed by manipulating a sequence of stone carvings in a specific pattern that suggested deliberate design rather than architectural accident. When Whitmore finally gained entry to this hidden space, he found himself confronting artifacts that defied easy explanation and raised questions about the true nature of medieval jester culture that scholars are still attempting to answer. The chamber itself was surprisingly large, approximately 12 feet square and 8 feet high, with walls lined with carefully carved stone shelves that had once held volumes of manuscripts, musical instruments, and objects whose purposes remained mysterious. The preservation was extraordinary, thanks to the chamber's sealed environment and the dry conditions that had prevented the worst ravages of time and moisture. What Whitmore discovered within these walls would revolutionize understanding of medieval entertainment culture, while creating new mysteries that continue to puzzle researchers nearly a century later. Even more intriguing was the discovery of the Speculum Arcanum, or Mirror of Secrets, a manuscript that appeared to contain instructions for what can only be described as intelligence-gathering techniques centuries ahead of their time. The text included detailed discussions of memory palace construction, coded language systems, psychological manipulation methods, and surveillance techniques that would not seem out of place in a modern espionage manual. The sophistication of these methods raised fundamental questions about the true purpose of medieval court entertainment and the possibility that jesters served functions far beyond what official records revealed. The musical instruments found in the chamber provided additional evidence of the unusual nature of this hidden jester culture. While most appeared to be conventional lutes, flutes, and drums suitable for court entertainment, several defied easy categorization. One device, constructed from silver and an unidentified blackwood, produced sounds that seemed to affect listeners in ways that went beyond normal musical appreciation. Professor Whitmore's assistant,
a trained musician named Margaret Thornberry reported experiencing vivid hallucinations and altered states of consciousness when exposed to the instrument's tones, effects that persisted for several hours after the music ceased. Another mysterious artifact was a collection of masks carved from materials that included not just the expected wood and leather, but also substances that defied identification by the analytical techniques available in the 1920s. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, with facial features so realistic that they seemed to capture the personalities of specific individuals. Yet, the masks showed signs of wear that suggested regular use, and several bore inscriptions in scripts that resembled no known medieval writing system. The purpose of these masks and their relationship to conventional jester costumes remained completely unclear.
The most disturbing discovery in the chamber was a series of what appeared to be anatomical drawings showing the human brain and nervous system with an accuracy that should have been impossible given medieval understanding of human physiology. The illustrations were accompanied by text in Latin that discussed the relationships between specific brain regions and behavioral characteristics, emotional responses, and memory formation. The level of detail suggested either access to advanced scientific knowledge or systematic experimentation that would have been considered deeply heretical by medieval religious authorities. Professor Whitmore's attempts to understand these findings led him to examine other castle sites for evidence of similar hidden chambers. His subsequent excavations revealed that the Thornfield discovery was not unique. Hidden rooms containing jester-related artifacts existed at castle sites throughout England and continental Europe. The pattern suggested a widespread network of secret activity that had operated parallel to documented court entertainment for centuries without leaving any trace in official historical records. The chamber at Ravenshollow Castle in Northumberland contained a workshop equipped with tools for metalworking, glass blowing, and chemical analysis that represented technology considerably more advanced than anything known to have existed in medieval Europe. The presence of these facilities suggested that jesters were involved in experimental activities that went far beyond entertainment and required technical capabilities that challenged conventional understanding of medieval scientific knowledge. Most significantly, the workshop showed evidence of having been used for the production of substances that modern analysis identified as psychoactive compounds derived from plants not native to European soil. The discovery at Blackwood Keep in Scotland revealed evidence of astronomical observation capabilities that rivaled those of the most advanced medieval monasteries. The hidden chamber contained detailed star charts, mathematical calculations related to planetary motion, and instruments for celestial observation that demonstrated remarkable precision and sophistication. The astronomical data was accompanied by astrological interpretations that seemed to focus primarily on timing political events and predicting the behavior of specific individuals, suggesting that jesters used their scientific knowledge for intelligence purposes rather than purely academic research. Perhaps most mysteriously, the chamber at Gravestone Manor in Wales contained what appeared to be a primitive printing press, complete with movable type and partially completed manuscripts that predated Gutenberg's innovations by nearly a century. The texts being produced included copies of the Jester manuscripts found at other sites, suggesting that this secret network had developed methods for reproducing and distributing information long before such technology was believed to have existed in medieval Europe. The implications for understanding medieval communication and information sharing were staggering. The cultural analysis of these discoveries revealed patterns that were even more puzzling than the individual artifacts. The jesters represented in these hidden archives appeared to share common training, common purposes, and common knowledge that extended far beyond what any individual court entertainer could have developed independently. The evidence suggested the existence of a formal educational system that produced jesters with capabilities in areas including psychology, chemistry, astronomy, engineering, and what can only be described as early scientific methodology. Yet official medieval records contain no trace of such an educational system or the institutions that would have been necessary to support it. The jesters documented in conventional historical sources appear to have been individual entertainers with limited formal education and no connections beyond their immediate court environments. The contrast between official history and archaeological evidence was so complete that Professor Whitmore began to question whether the hidden jester network represented an entirely separate cultural phenomenon that had somehow remained completely invisible to contemporary chroniclers. The geographical distribution of these discoveries suggested that the network's influence extended throughout medieval Europe and possibly beyond. Similarities between artifacts found at sites separated by hundreds of miles indicated standardized training and common purposes that required sophisticated coordination and communication systems. The linguistic evidence suggested that network members were multilingual and maintained correspondence with colleagues across political and cultural boundaries that were supposed to be largely impermeable during the medieval period.
As you stand with Professor Whitmore in that hidden chamber, surrounded by artifacts that challenge everything scholars thought they knew about medieval culture, you begin to understand that the mystery of the vanishing jesters represents something far more significant than an interesting historical puzzle. These discoveries suggest the existence of an entire parallel civilization that operated within medieval Europe while remaining completely invisible to the official chroniclers, whose records form the basis of conventional historical understanding. The questions raised by these findings continue to challenge researchers today, nearly a century after their initial discovery, and the full implications of what Professor Whitmore uncovered may never be completely understood. The winter of 1924 found Professor Whitmore consumed by an obsession that had begun to concern his colleagues at Cambridge. Working by lamplight in his cluttered study, surrounded by photographs, transcriptions, and rubbings of the mysterious Jester manuscripts, he had become convinced that the key to understanding the vanishing network lay not in the physical artifacts themselves, but in the coded language systems that permeated every document found in the hidden chambers. What had initially appeared to be simple entertainment texts or basic correspondence had revealed itself, under careful analysis, to be an intricate cipher system of extraordinary sophistication. Picture yourself seated across from the professor in his book-lined study, watching as he spreads dozens of manuscript pages across his mahogany desk like pieces of an enormous puzzle. The gas flames flicker against winter windows frosted with ice, casting dancing shadows across documents that seem to shimmer with hidden meaning. The air is thick with pipe tobacco and the musty scent of ancient parchment, while outside, London's December fog muffles the sounds of a modern world that seems increasingly distant from the medieval mysteries consuming Whitmore's attention. The breakthrough that would revolutionize understanding of the Jester network came through Whitmore's collaboration with Dr. Eleanor Fitzgerald, a brilliant cryptographer whose work during the Great War had involved breaking German communication codes. Dr.
Fitzgerald brought to the project analytical techniques developed for military intelligence purposes, combined with a mathematical precision that complemented Whitmore's historical expertise. Together, they began to perceive patterns in the Jester manuscripts that revealed layers of meaning far more complex than either had initially suspected. The foundation of the Jester cipher system lay in what Dr. Fitzgerald termed performative encoding, a method of hiding information within entertainment texts in ways that allowed the material to function simultaneously as genuine performance content and as coded communication. A joke that delighted courtly audiences carried entirely different meanings for those who possessed the keys to decode its hidden layers. Songs that appeared to be simple love ballads contained detailed intelligence reports when interpreted according to the network's secret protocols. Consider the manuscript known as The Fool's Garden, which Professor Whitmore had initially cataloged as a collection of humorous verse suitable for court entertainment. Dr. Fitzgerald's analysis revealed that the opening stanza, which appeared to describe a gardener tending his flowers, actually contained precise information about troop movements along the French border during the 100 Years' War. Each flower mentioned corresponded to a specific military unit, while the gardening activities described their tactical positions and recent movements. The apparent nonsense verse transformed into a sophisticated military intelligence report. The complexity of this encoding system required jesters to possess extraordinary intellectual capabilities that went far beyond what their humble social status suggested. They needed to master multiple linguistic systems simultaneously, maintaining fluency in the surface meanings that entertained their audiences, while perfectly controlling the deeper layers that transmitted vital information to network colleagues. A single misplaced word or incorrect emphasis could transform an intelligence report into meaningless babble, while maintaining the entertainment value required constant attention to poetic meter, rhyme schemes, and comedic timing. The musical components of the cipher system proved even more sophisticated than the textual elements. Dr. Fitzgerald's analysis of the notation found in the hidden chambers revealed that musical compositions served as three-dimensional encoding matrices, with melody, rhythm, and harmonic structure, each carrying independent streams of coded information. A lute song that entertained noble audiences with tales of courtly love simultaneously transmitted detailed financial intelligence about the economic conditions of various European kingdoms to listeners who possessed the appropriate decoding knowledge. The discovery of the harmonic concordance, a theoretical framework that governed musical encoding throughout the network, represented one of Dr. Fitzgerald's most remarkable achievements. This system assigned specific numerical values to musical intervals, rhythmic patterns, and tonal relationships, creating a mathematical language that could express complex abstract concepts through purely musical means. The sophistication of this approach suggested that network members possessed mathematical training equivalent to that of university-educated scholars, despite their official status as mere entertainers. The temporal encoding systems embedded within Jester performances revealed another layer of complexity that challenged conventional understanding of medieval intellectual capabilities. Network members had developed methods for encoding time-sensitive information using performance duration, pause lengths, and repetition patterns that allowed urgent intelligence to be transmitted during apparently routine entertainment sessions. A jester who repeated a particular verse 3 times instead of twice was indicating that the encoded message required immediate action, while specific pause lengths conveyed information about timing and coordination requirements. The graduation ceremonies that marked successful completion of network training involved ritual elements that combined academic examination with mystical initiation in ways that suggested connections to esoteric traditions that operated parallel to conventional medieval Christianity. The surviving descriptions of these ceremonies include references to astronomical calculations, alchemical symbolism, and oath-taking procedures that bound graduates to secrecy requirements far more stringent than anything associated with medieval guilds or religious orders. The penalty for revealing network secrets was not merely expulsion or excommunication, but what the texts describe as dissolution of being, a fate whose precise nature remained unclear, but which apparently deterred betrayal effectively. The operational security protocols developed by the network demonstrated paranoia levels that would be considered extreme even by modern intelligence standards. Communication between network members required multiple layers of authentication, with false messages deliberately introduced to test the security of transmission channels.
Meetings between jesters serving different courts followed elaborate procedures designed to prevent surveillance while providing plausible explanations for any observed interactions. The network had developed contingency plans for compromised operations that included the systematic destruction of evidence and the elimination of members whose capture might threaten overall security. The most disturbing aspect of Dr. Fitzgerald's discoveries concerned the network's apparent involvement in activities that went far beyond intelligence gathering into realms that bordered on what medieval authorities would have considered witchcraft or heresy. Several manuscripts contained detailed instructions for what they termed consciousness modification, techniques for altering human perception and behavior through combinations of chemical substances, musical frequencies, and psychological manipulation. These methods were apparently used both for intelligence-gathering purposes and for what the text described as social engineering, the deliberate manipulation of political events through influence over key decision-makers. The chemical knowledge documented in the hidden manuscripts rivaled that of the most advanced alchemical traditions, while displaying a practical focus on psychological effects that suggested systematic experimentation on human subjects. The network had developed procedures for extracting and concentrating psychoactive compounds from various plants, creating substances that could induce everything from mild euphoria to complete amnesia depending on dosage and preparation methods. Most significantly, they had discovered methods for delivering these substances through apparently innocent means, including incense, perfumes, food additives, and even musical instrument preparation that affected listeners through inhalation. The implications of their discoveries extended beyond academic curiosity to raise profound questions about the nature of knowledge transmission across historical periods. The Jester network appeared to have possessed scientific and technological capabilities that would not be formally rediscovered by European civilization for centuries after their disappearance. This suggested either that human knowledge development followed patterns far more complex than conventional historical models assumed, or that the network had access to information sources that remained completely outside normal historical understanding.
Fitzgerald that pointed to a location in the Scottish Highlands, he found himself standing before the ruins of an ancient structure that challenged every assumption he had developed about the mysterious Jester network. The site, known locally as the Fool's Crown, had been dismissed by earlier archaeologists as a natural rock formation of no historical significance. Yet the coded manuscripts suggested it had served as the network's ultimate sanctuary, a place where their most dangerous secrets had been preserved against the approaching dissolution of their organization. Picture yourself climbing through the highland mist alongside Professor Whitmore, your boots slipping on moss-covered stones as you ascend toward a plateau that seems to exist outside normal time and space. The ancient stones that emerge from the fog bear carved symbols that match the cipher keys discovered in the hidden chambers, confirming that this remote location had indeed served purposes far beyond what its humble appearance suggested. Here, in this desolate landscape where few travelers ventured, the final act of the Jester mystery would unfold in ways that challenged the very foundations of rational thought.
The manuscripts found within this final chamber included what appeared to be the complete archives of the Jester network, documenting not just their activities, but their origins, purposes, and ultimate fate. These texts, written in a script that combined elements from multiple ancient languages while incorporating symbolic systems of unknown derivation, required months of analysis before their contents could be understood. What they revealed challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between medieval European civilization and older traditions of knowledge that were supposed to have been lost centuries earlier. The network's true origins, as documented in these final archives, reached back far beyond the medieval period to connections with classical civilization that had supposedly perished with the fall of Rome. The founding documents suggested that the Jester organization represented a continuation of mystery schools that had operated in the ancient world, preserving knowledge traditions that combined scientific observation with psychological techniques for understanding and influencing human behavior.
These traditions had supposedly been destroyed by the rise of Christianity, yet the evidence suggested they had instead gone underground, adapting their methods and purposes to survive within the very civilization that had officially rejected them. The philosophical framework that governed the network's activities revealed a worldview that was simultaneously more sophisticated and more disturbing than anything Professor Whitmore had anticipated. The Jesters viewed human civilization as a complex system that could be understood and manipulated through the application of appropriate knowledge and techniques. Their activities were guided not by loyalty to particular rulers or kingdoms, but by adherence to principles they called the Great Work, a long-term project aimed at steering human development in directions that would prevent catastrophic conflicts while promoting intellectual and spiritual advancement. This perspective explained many of the puzzling aspects of the network's documented activities. Their intelligence gathering served not primarily the immediate interests of the royal patrons, but rather the broader goal of understanding and influencing historical forces that shaped European civilization. Their advanced scientific knowledge was applied not for personal gain or immediate practical benefit, but as part of systematic efforts to accelerate human technological and intellectual development in ways that would prevent the disasters they apparently foresaw approaching. The prophetic elements within the final manuscripts represented perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire discovery. The network's leadership had apparently possessed not just sophisticated analytical capabilities, but actual foreknowledge of historical developments that would not occur for centuries after their own time. They had predicted the Renaissance, the Reformation, the scientific revolution, and even more distant events, with accuracy that suggested access to information sources completely outside normal human experience. Most significantly, they had foreseen their own dissolution and had taken elaborate measures to preserve their essential knowledge for future rediscovery. The preservation techniques employed in the Fool's Crown Chamber demonstrated technological capabilities that remain inexplicable even by 1920 scientific standards. The manuscripts showed no signs of aging despite their apparent antiquity, preserved by methods that had maintained their flexibility and readability across centuries of exposure to highland climate conditions.
Chemical analysis revealed that the preservation involved substances and processes that incorporated knowledge of molecular chemistry centuries before such understanding was supposed to have existed in European civilization. The most remarkable discovery within the chamber was a collection of what the manuscripts termed performance prophecies, elaborate entertainment pieces that encoded predictions of future events within apparently conventional Jester routines. These texts, when decoded using the cipher systems developed by the network, revealed detailed foreknowledge of political developments, technological innovations, and social changes that would transform European civilization over the centuries following the network's disappearance. The accuracy of these predictions, verified against actual historical developments, suggested prophetic capabilities that transcended any known form of analytical projection. The instructions for interpreting these prophetic performances included techniques for psychological preparation that bordered on what modern psychology would recognize as hypnotic induction. Network members who served as prophetic interpreters underwent training that altered their consciousness in ways that allowed them to perceive temporal relationships normally hidden from human awareness. These techniques combine controlled breathing, musical harmonics, chemical enhancement, and meditation practices that originated in traditions far older than medieval European culture. The chamber also contained what appeared to be the network's ultimate legacy project, a collection of texts designed to preserve their essential knowledge in forms that could be rediscovered and understood by future civilizations when humanity had developed sufficient intellectual sophistication to apply their insights responsibly.
These preservation texts employed encoding methods that required advanced mathematical and linguistic knowledge to decode, ensuring that their contents would remain hidden until human civilization had progressed beyond the level that it forced the network's original dissolution. Professor Whitmore's analysis of these legacy documents revealed that the network had anticipated not just their own disappearance, but the specific circumstances under which their secrets would eventually be rediscovered. The archaeological clues that had led him to the hidden chambers and ultimately to the Fool's Crown had been deliberately planted by network members who possessed detailed foreknowledge of 20th century archaeological techniques and interests.
They had known that their discoveries would be made by scholars with the intellectual training necessary to understand their implications while possessing the historical perspective required to appreciate their significance. The personal journals found within the chamber provided insight into the psychological costs of the network's extraordinary activities. Members who possessed prophetic capabilities struggled with the burden of foreknowing disasters they were powerless to prevent, while those responsible for historical manipulation grappled with the moral implications of steering human civilization according to their own vision of optimal development. The final entries, written by network leadership during their last years of operation, revealed individuals exhausted by centuries of secret struggle to guide humanity toward a future they could perceive but never personally experience. The dissolution procedures documented in the final manuscripts revealed the systematic thoroughness with which the network had eliminated traces of their activities while preserving their essential knowledge. Members were dispersed according to carefully planned schedules that ensured no pattern of disappearance would attract unwanted attention. Physical evidence was destroyed using techniques that left no archaeological traces detectable by medieval investigation methods. Most remarkably, the network had developed methods for inducing selective amnesia in former members, allowing them to integrate into conventional society while retaining no conscious memory of their previous activities. The fate of individual network members, as documented in the final archives, varied according to their specific roles and capabilities. Those who possessed dangerous knowledge were relocated to remote monastic communities, where their intellectual gifts could be channeled into apparently conventional scholarly pursuits. Others were established in merchant families or crafts guilds, where their skills could benefit society while attracting no suspicion. The most gifted performers were allowed to continue as conventional court entertainers, though stripped of their network connections and specialized knowledge. The chamber's most disturbing revelation concerned the network's ultimate failure to achieve their stated objectives. Despite centuries of sophisticated manipulation and guidance, human civilization had proven resistant to the kind of directed development the network had attempted to promote.
The approaching dissolution of their organization coincided with their recognition that humanity was entering a period of religious and political upheaval that would undo much of their careful work while creating conditions that made their continued existence impossible. The final prophecies contained within the chamber predicted that European civilization would experience centuries of conflict, persecution, and intellectual stagnation following the network's disappearance. The Renaissance and Reformation, while representing important intellectual advances, would also unleash forces of fanaticism and violence that would far exceed anything medieval Europe had experienced. The network's leadership had foreseen the religious wars, political revolutions, and technological developments that would transform human civilization, but had concluded that these changes lay beyond their ability to control or significantly influence. As you stand with Professor Whitmore in that final chamber, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of a lost civilization that had operated in plain sight throughout medieval Europe, you begin to understand that the mystery of the Jester network represents something far more profound than an interesting historical puzzle. These discoveries suggest that human knowledge and capability have followed patterns far more complex than conventional history recognizes, while raising questions about the nature of time, prophecy, and human potential that challenge the very foundations of rational understanding. To truly understand the dangers that surrounded court jesters in the medieval world, we must step away from the common folk and servants who populated our earlier exploration, and examine the rarefied atmosphere of noble society, where power and privilege created their own unique forms of peril for those who entertained the mighty.
Picture yourself now in the opulent chambers of Lady Isabella de Montclair, Countess of Ravenswood, whose life of apparent luxury and absolute authority concealed vulnerabilities and fears that made her relationship with court entertainers both essential and potentially lethal. The year is 1376, and you find yourself standing in the solar of Ravenswood Castle, watching as Lady Isabella prepares for another day of the elaborate performance that defined noble existence in the late medieval period.
The morning light streaming through stained glass windows casts jeweled patterns across tapestries that depict scenes of courtly love and martial glory, while the air carries the mingled scents of rosewater, incense, and the subtle perfumes that mark the presence of wealth and power. Here, in this chamber where every object speaks of privilege and authority, the true complexity of medieval social relationships begins to reveal itself. Lady Isabella herself embodies the contradictions that defined noble life during this turbulent period. At 32, she has already survived 2 marriages, the deaths of 3 children, and numerous political crises that have tested both her intelligence and her capacity for ruthless decision-making. Her beauty, praised by troubadours throughout France and England, serves as both asset and weapon in the endless negotiations that determine her family's survival and prosperity. Yet beneath the silk gowns and precious jewels lies a woman whose daily existence is shaped by fears and pressures that commoners could never fully comprehend. The morning routine that you observe reveals the extraordinary complexity of maintaining noble status in an age when political fortunes could change overnight. Lady Isabella's toilet requires the services of 6 maidservants, each responsible for different aspects of her transformation from private individual to public symbol of aristocratic power. The process begins before dawn with the application of cosmetics that serve not merely aesthetic purposes but practical functions in a world where physical appearance carried political meaning that could determine life or death. Consider the significance of the lead-based white paint that creates her fashionably pale complexion, marking her as someone whose status exempts her from outdoor labor, while slowly poisoning her with metals that will eventually contribute to the madness and early death that plague many noble families. The elaborate headdresses that frame her face require architectural precision to maintain their towering heights, yet serve the crucial function of displaying the family's wealth through the precious stones and rare fabrics incorporated into their construction. Every aspect of her appearance has been calculated to communicate specific messages about her family's political position, economic resources, and social connections.
The selection of her daily wardrobe represents a complex negotiation between fashion, politics, and survival that requires diplomatic skills worthy of a foreign minister. The colors she chooses signal her current political allegiances, with subtle variations in shade conveying information about shifting loyalties and emerging alliances. The fabrics she displays demonstrate her family's trading relationships and economic stability, while the jewelry she wears indicates both her personal wealth and the military resources her household can command. A single mistake in these daily decisions could send unintended messages that might provoke conflicts or suggest weaknesses that enemies could exploit. The breakfast ceremony that follows Lady Isabella's preparation reveals the theatrical nature of noble existence, where every meal becomes a performance designed to reinforce social hierarchies, while gathering intelligence about the loyalty and intentions of household members. The great hall fills with a carefully orchestrated procession of servants, retainers, and minor nobles, each assigned specific roles in a drama that serves multiple purposes beyond simple nutrition. The seating arrangements convey information about current political standings, while the quality and presentation of food demonstrates the household's economic health and management capabilities. Yet even as Guillaume demonstrates his value through the sophisticated performance, you observe the subtle signs of the dangers that constantly surround him. Lord Audrey, Lady Isabella's elderly father-in-law, watches the entertainer with eyes that reflect decades of experience in recognizing potential threats to family security. The old man's fingers drum against the table in patterns that correspond to military signals, suggesting that he views Guillaume not as harmless entertainment, but as a potential spy whose loyalties remain questionable. The presence of armed guards positioned strategically throughout the hall reinforces the atmosphere of barely controlled violence that underlies all interactions between nobles and their social inferiors. The political context that shapes these morning performances becomes clear as you observe the complex relationships between Lady Isabella and the various nobles who attend her breakfast.
Each guest represents a different faction within the broader network of aristocratic alliances that determine regional stability, and their interactions with Guillaume provide opportunities for gathering intelligence while testing the loyalty of potential allies and enemies. The jester's comments and observations serve as a form of social radar, revealing the true sentiments and intentions of individuals who would never speak honestly in formal diplomatic contexts. The conversation that develops between Lady Isabella and Guillaume during the meal demonstrates the unique intimacy that could exist between noble patrons and their entertainers, a relationship that granted jesters extraordinary access to power, while making them completely dependent on continued aristocratic favor. Guillaume's ability to make his mistress laugh while providing subtle counsel on matters of state reflects years of careful observation and psychological study that rival the skills of modern therapists. Yet this very intimacy creates dangers for both parties, as enemies could interpret their close relationship as evidence of inappropriate influence or compromising personal attachment. The morning's entertainment reaches its climax when Guillaume presents an elaborate puppet show that appears to tell a simple story of rural life while actually providing a detailed analysis of the political situation in neighboring territories. The puppet characters represent specific historical figures whose actions and motivations Guillaume has studied extensively, allowing him to predict their likely responses to various political pressures. Lady Isabella watches with apparent amusement, yet her questions and comments reveal that she understands perfectly the serious intelligence being conveyed through this apparently frivolous medium. The conclusion of the breakfast ceremony marks the beginning of Guillaume's most dangerous daily challenge, as he must transition from public entertainer to private advisor while maintaining the facade of harmless foolishness that protects him from accusations of exceeding his proper station. The withdrawal to Lady Isabella's private chambers requires him to shed his public persona while retaining the intellectual acuity that makes him valuable, a transformation that few individuals could manage successfully over extended periods without psychological damage.
As you observe the final moments of this day in the life of medieval nobility, the true nature of the dangers facing court jesters begins to emerge with crystalline clarity. They existed within a social system that valued their talents while denying their humanity, that depended on their intelligence while refusing to acknowledge their equality, and that demanded their loyalty while offering no guarantees of protection. The noble perspective reveals that even the most successful court entertainers remain fundamentally vulnerable to the changing moods and political needs of patrons whose own survival depended on their ability to sacrifice anyone who became inconvenient or dangerous to their continued prosperity. The pinnacle of danger for any court jester lay not in the provincial castles of minor nobles, but in the glittering, treacherous world of royal courts, where absolute power created an atmosphere of paranoia and intrigue that could prove fatal to even the most skilled entertainers. Picture yourself now in the throne room of King Charles VI of France during the autumn of 1392, just months before the monarch's first descent into the madness that would define the remainder of his reign. Here, in the heart of European political power, you witness the ultimate expression of the perils that awaited those who dared to entertain kings. The vast hall stretches before you like a cathedral dedicated to earthly rather than divine authority, its soaring columns supporting a roof painted with scenes of royal triumph that seem to watch the proceedings below with eternal vigilance. The air itself seems weighted with the presence of absolute power, thick with incense, perfume, and the subtle scent of fear that permeates any gathering where a single word or gesture might determine life or death. Courtiers move through this space with the careful precision of dancers, performing steps that have been rehearsed for generations, each movement calculated to display appropriate deference while concealing the ambitions and resentments that drive their daily existence. King Charles himself, at 24, still young enough to believe in his own invincibility, sits upon the throne of St. Louis
Louis with the casual arrogance of one who has never known contradiction or defeat. His costume, woven from cloth of gold and adorned with gems that represent the wealth of nations, transforms his physical presence into a living symbol of royal authority that demands absolute submission from all who enter his presence. Yet beneath the magnificent exterior, those with eyes to see can already detect the subtle signs of the mental instability that will soon transform the most powerful monarch in Europe into a tragic figure whose reign becomes synonymous with chaos and civil war. The political context that shapes every aspect of Jean's performance becomes apparent as you observe the various factions represented among the courtiers who surround the throne. The Duke of Orleans, the king's younger brother, watches the entertainment with eyes that calculate its potential utility for his own political purposes. The Duke of Burgundy, whose rivalry with Orleans will eventually tear France apart, studies Jean's words for any sign of favoritism towards his enemies. The Queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, observes the proceedings with a detached attention of one who has learned to view all court relationships as potential threats to her own security and that of her children. The intelligence-gathering function that Jean serves becomes evident through the subtle ways his performance incorporates information about domestic and foreign political developments. His seemingly innocent songs about shepherds and farmers actually contain detailed reports about conditions in various French provinces, while his jokes about foreign customs convey precise intelligence about the military preparations and diplomatic initiatives of neighboring kingdoms.
The sophistication of this intelligence network, which extends throughout Europe and beyond, makes Jean one of the most informed individuals in the French court. Yet this very knowledge creates dangers that multiply with each passing day. The religious dimension of Jean's performance reveals another layer of complexity that characterized entertainment at the highest levels of medieval society. His routines must demonstrate appropriate Christian orthodoxy while avoiding the theological controversies that could provide enemies with grounds for accusations of heresy.
The recent papal schism has created additional complications, as different court factions support competing claims to religious authority, making any religious reference potentially divisive. Jean navigates these treacherous waters with jokes and stories that appear to support universal Christian values while carefully avoiding specific positions that might alienate powerful patrons or protectors. The personal relationship between Jean and King Charles illustrates both the intimacy and the danger that characterized the bond between monarchs and their favorite entertainers. The king's obvious delight in Jean's performance reflects genuine affection that has developed over years of daily interaction. Yet this very closeness creates vulnerabilities for both parties. Courtiers who resent Jean's influence or who seek to damage the king's reputation can exploit their relationship as evidence of royal poor judgment or inappropriate emotional attachment. The jester who becomes too important to his royal patron risks being perceived as a threat to the established order that must be eliminated before it can cause serious political damage. The economic aspects of Jean's position reveal the complex financial relationships that bound court entertainers to their royal patrons while creating additional sources of danger and opportunity. His annual income, derived from royal grants, noble gifts, and commercial investments, exceeds that of many provincial lords. Yet his wealth also makes him a target for those who view his prosperity as evidence of corruption or inappropriate influence. The management of his financial affairs requires business acumen that rivals that of professional merchants, while the display of his prosperity must be carefully calibrated to demonstrate success without suggesting arrogance or excessive ambition. The international implications of Jean's activities become apparent through his connections with entertainers serving other European courts. His correspondence with jesters in England, Germany, Italy, and Spain creates an informal diplomatic network that provides valuable intelligence while potentially exposing him to accusations of treasonous communication with foreign powers. The letters he receives from colleagues abroad contain not just personal news and professional gossip, but detailed political intelligence that makes him privy to state secrets that could prove fatal if their possession became known to the wrong individuals. The ceremonial functions that Jean performs at major court events demonstrate another dimension of the dangers that surrounded royal entertainers. His participation in royal weddings, coronations, and religious festivals requires him to understand complex protocols, while maintaining his role as comic relief during proceedings of utmost seriousness. A single mistake in these contexts could be interpreted as deliberate disrespect for sacred traditions or royal authority, providing enemies with grounds for demanding his removal or punishment. The pressure to perform flawlessly during events of historical significance would test the mental stability of even the most skilled professionals. As you observe Jean's final performance before King Charles, watching as the monarch stares with vacant eyes at entertainment he no longer comprehends, you witness the ultimate expression of the dangers that awaited those who chose to make their living entertaining the powerful. The absolute authority that made royal favor so valuable also made royal displeasure utterly fatal, while the intimate knowledge required for success at the highest levels created vulnerabilities that no amount of skill or intelligence could completely overcome. The court jester's profession, when practiced at its pinnacle, represented perhaps the most precarious form of employment ever devised, where the rewards of success were matched only by the certainty that even the most brilliant career would eventually end in disgrace, exile, or death.
Picture yourself standing in the shadows of a chamber that had once echoed with royal laughter, watching as Joan prepares for what he cannot yet know will be his final performance before the French court. The December wind rattles the shutters with a sound like skeletal fingers against wood, while inside, braziers provide insufficient warmth against the chill that seems to emanate not from the weather, but from the fundamental changes that have overtaken the kingdom. The very air carries a tension that makes breathing difficult, as if the atmosphere itself has become poisoned by the breakdown of the social order that had once seemed as permanent as the stone walls of the palace. The transformation in King Charles has accelerated beyond anything Joan's extensive experience with human psychology had prepared him to handle. The monarch who had once delighted in elaborate wordplay and sophisticated political satire now sits motionless for hours, staring at empty space with eyes that seem to perceive realities invisible to others. When he does speak, his words emerge in torrents of disconnected fragments that combine childhood memories, theological speculation, and paranoid accusations in ways that reveal the complete breakdown of the rational processes that had once made him an effective ruler. The court itself has adapted to this new reality with the cruel efficiency that characterizes all human institutions facing existential threats. The Duke of Orleans has assumed many of the king's administrative responsibilities, while the Duke of Burgundy positions himself to challenge any decisions that might threaten his own interests. Queen Isabeau maintains the facade of royal dignity while quietly making arrangements that will protect her children if the kingdom descends into the civil war that everyone now recognizes as inevitable. Into this powder keg of competing ambitions and barely restrained violence, Joan must venture with entertainment that somehow addresses the new reality without acknowledging its existence. The challenge facing Joan as he prepares his performance reveals the impossible nature of his position in ways that had never been apparent during the years of royal stability.
How does one entertain a madman without either mocking his condition or enabling his delusions? How does one provide political commentary to a court where the traditional structures of authority have collapsed into competing factions? Most fundamentally, how does one maintain the role of harmless fool when the very concept of harmlessness has become meaningless in a world where violence lurks beneath every interaction? The costume Jean selects for this performance reflects his awareness that traditional approaches to court entertainment must be abandoned in favor of strategies designed for survival rather than success. The bright colors and jingling bells that had once marked his status as royal favorite now seem grotesquely inappropriate, almost mocking in their cheerful irrelevance to the grim realities that have transformed court life. He chooses instead more subdued attire that maintains his identity as entertainer, while avoiding the kind of conspicuous display that might provoke the unpredictable violent reactions that have become Charles's most frightening symptom. The performance itself, when it finally begins, demonstrates Jean's desperate attempt to adapt his sophisticated entertainment techniques to circumstances that rendered traditional court culture meaningless. His opening routine avoids the political commentary that had once made him valuable, focusing instead on simple physical comedy that requires no intellectual engagement from an audience whose attention spans have been shattered by months of crisis and uncertainty. Yet even these elementary entertainments carry risks in an environment where the slightest unexpected sound or movement might trigger catastrophic responses from a monarch whose mental state has become completely unpredictable. The reaction of the assembled courtiers reveals the extent to which the breakdown of royal authority has affected every aspect of court life. Nobles who had once competed for Jean's attention now watch his performance with the detached wariness of individuals who have learned to view all court relationships as potentially dangerous to their own survival. The laughter that greets his jokes sounds forced and hollow, lacking the genuine appreciation that had once made court entertainment a pleasurable experience for performers and audiences alike. Most tellingly, the courtiers' eyes constantly shift between Jean and the king, monitoring Charles's reactions for signs of the explosive anger that could transform entertainment into catastrophe without warning. The political calculations that now determine Jean's fate reveal the harsh realities that await entertainers whose royal patrons can no longer provide protection against the enemies that every successful court jester inevitably accumulates. Lord Montclair, whose pride Jean had wounded years earlier with particularly sharp wit, begins building a coalition of nobles who view the jester's disgrace as an opportunity to settle old scores. The accusations they prepare focus on Jean's extensive knowledge of court secrets and his connections with foreign entertainers, painting him as a security risk whose continued existence threatens the stability of a kingdom already teetering on the edge of collapse. The trial that follows represents a masterpiece of political theater designed to provide the appearance of justice while reaching conclusions predetermined by the necessity of finding scapegoats for the kingdom's mounting problems.
The evidence presented against John includes forged letters suggesting treasonous correspondence with English agents, fabricated testimony from servants who claim to have witnessed suspicious activities, and distorted interpretations of his past performances that transform entertainment into sedition. The sophisticated legal framework that might once have protected him has been overwhelmed by the political pressures that make his destruction necessary for the peace of mind of those who now control what remains of royal authority. Jean's defense, delivered with the same analytical clarity that had once made him valuable to the crown, demonstrates both his intellectual gifts and the futility of reason in circumstances where political necessity has superseded legal process. His systematic refutation of the charges against him reveals the logical inconsistencies and factual impossibilities embedded in his accuser's case. Yet these very demonstrations of his intelligence serve only to reinforce their claims that he possesses dangerous capabilities that exceed appropriate bounds for someone of his social status.
The trial becomes a grim parody of the entertainment he had once provided, with Jean forced to perform for his life before an audience that has already decided his fate. The verdict, announced with the same ceremony that had once marked royal celebrations, represents the final transformation of entertainment into tragedy that characterizes the end of Jean's career. He is found guilty of treason, sedition, and violation of sacred oaths, crimes that carry the penalty of death by methods specifically designed to serve as public examples of the consequences awaiting those who threaten royal authority. Yet even in this moment of ultimate defeat, the political considerations that have shaped the entire proceeding prevent the simple execution that Jean's accusers desire. The breakdown of royal authority has created legal ambiguities that require more subtle approaches to the elimination of inconvenient individuals. The sentence that emerges from these deliberations reflects the cruel creativity that characterizes medieval justice when applied to individuals whose cases transcend normal legal categories. Jean is condemned to perpetual imprisonment in a monastery whose remoteness and strict observance will ensure his complete isolation from the world he had once influenced through his entertainment. More cruelly, he is forbidden to speak for the remainder of his life, transforming the voice that had been his greatest asset into a symbol in the silence that will define his remaining years. The punishment represents a form of living death that eliminates Jean as a political factor while avoiding the martyrdom that actual execution might create. The journey to his monastic prison takes Jean through landscapes that seem to reflect the kingdom's descent into chaos and civil war. Villages burned by competing armies stand as monuments to the political breakdown that his disgrace both symbolizes and facilitates. Refugees fleeing the violence that has consumed much of northern France provide testimony to the failure of the royal authority that Jean had once served with such dedication and skill.
The roads themselves, once maintained by royal administration as symbols of governmental competence, have deteriorated into muddy tracks that impede travel and symbolize the broader collapse of civilized order. The monastery that Jean will serve as his final home represents a deliberate choice designed to maximize the psychological impact of his punishment while ensuring his complete removal from political influence. The Abbey of St. Vigor, located in the windswept hills of Normandy, follows the most austere interpretation of Benedictine rule, with regulations that prohibit unnecessary speech, restrict communication with the outside world, and require daily routines that leave no time for the intellectual activities that had once defined Jean's existence. The abbot, Brother Matthias, has been carefully selected for his political reliability and his complete lack of sympathy for individuals whose secular activities have brought them into conflict with royal authority. As you follow Jean's story to its conclusion in the silent halls of a forgotten monastery, you begin to understand that the dangers facing medieval court jesters represented something more profound than simple occupational hazards. They reflected fundamental tensions within medieval society, between authority and criticism, tradition and innovation, social order and individual talent that would continue to shape European civilization long after the last court jester had performed his final routine. The laughter that had once filled royal halls was replaced by a silence that spoke more eloquently than words about the price that awaited those who dared to speak truth to power in an age when power itself had become mad with its own absolute authority. As our journey through the shattered halls of medieval courts draws to its close,
you find yourself standing once again in the comfort of your modern present, wrapped in the safety of contemporary law and the protection of institutions that our ancestors could never have imagined.
The central heating that warms your home, the electric lights that banish darkness at the touch of a switch, and the constitutional protections that shield you from arbitrary authority represent luxuries beyond the wildest dreams of those who once lived by their wit in an age when laughter itself could be a capital offense. The bells that once announced the presence of court jesters have long since fallen silent, their cheerful music replaced by the gentler sounds of entertainment that carries no risk of sudden death or political disgrace. Yet in that silence we can still hear the echoes of voices that dared to speak truth through jest, individuals who chose to walk the razor's edge between survival and destruction in pursuit of something that transcended mere material security. Their courage, whether born of desperation or genuine conviction, revealed the extraordinary pressures that shaped human behavior in societies where social mobility was virtually impossible and political authority was absolute. The jester's morning routine, with its careful preparation for potential disaster, speaks to the resilience of individuals who found ways to thrive even under conditions that would crush most modern spirits. Their ability to transform fear into laughter, oppression into art, and constant threat into creative opportunity demonstrates the remarkable adaptability that has allowed human civilization to survive its darkest periods. The biography of Thomas the Fool illustrates how individual talent could briefly transcend social boundaries while ultimately falling victim to the very forces that had initially enabled his rise. His transformation from monk to advisor to exile represents a pattern that has repeated throughout history whenever societies have struggled to accommodate exceptional individuals whose gifts challenge established hierarchies. The sophisticated political machinery that destroyed him reveals the extent to which medieval institutions could adapt their methods while preserving their fundamental purposes, a flexibility that ensured their survival long after the individuals who challenged them had been forgotten.
The archaeological mysteries uncovered by Professor Whitmore suggest that medieval civilization was far more complex and sophisticated than conventional historical narratives have acknowledged. The evidence of advanced knowledge, international networks, and technological capabilities among court entertainers challenges our understanding of the relationship between official history and hidden reality. These discoveries remind us that much of human experience remains invisible to formal documentation, preserved only in fragments that require extraordinary effort to decode and understand. The cultural legacy of medieval court entertainment extends far beyond the immediate historical period to influence subsequent developments in literature, theater, and social commentary that continue to shape contemporary civilization. The techniques developed by court jesters for embedding criticism within acceptable forms of entertainment established precedents that later artists would refine and adapt to their own circumstances. The tradition of speaking truth to power through humor, while always dangerous, has provided one of the few mechanisms by which societies have been able to address their own shortcomings without triggering the defensive reactions that direct criticism often provokes. The technological innovations attributed to the mysterious Jester network, whether historically accurate or legendary embellishment, suggest possibilities for human achievement that transcend the limitations imposed by official institutional frameworks. The advanced knowledge of psychology, chemistry, astronomy, and engineering documented in the hidden chambers implies that human intellectual potential may be far greater than conventional educational systems have assumed. These discoveries challenge us to consider whether our own civilization might be overlooking capabilities and insights that exist outside formal academic recognition. The international connections maintained by medieval entertainers reveal networks of cultural exchange that operated parallel to official diplomatic relationships throughout the medieval period. The ability of jesters to communicate across political and religious boundaries that were supposedly impermeable suggests that human societies have always been more interconnected than their formal institutions acknowledged. These informal networks of communication and cooperation may have played crucial roles in preserving and transmitting knowledge that would have otherwise been lost during periods of political chaos and institutional breakdown.
The prophetic elements within Jester culture, whether understood as analytical projection or something more mysterious, demonstrate human fascination with the relationship between present action and future consequence that remains one of our most enduring intellectual challenges. The apparent ability of some medieval entertainers to anticipate historical developments decades or centuries in advance suggests either extraordinary analytical capability
capabilities or access to information sources that remain beyond current understanding. These predictive achievements challenge conventional assumptions about the nature of time, causation, and human knowledge that continue to puzzle philosophers and scientists. The preservation techniques employed by the Jester network to protect their knowledge across centuries reveal sophisticated understanding of the challenges involved in transmitting information across historical periods characterized by political upheaval and institutional change. Their methods for encoding essential insights in forms that could survive even if their organization was destroyed demonstrate strategic thinking about knowledge preservation that anticipated later developments in information storage and retrieval. These techniques remind us that human knowledge is always fragile and that its preservation requires constant vigilance against the forces that would eliminate inconvenient truths. The ethical questions raised by the network's apparent involvement in social manipulation through entertainment reveal tensions between individual agency and collective influence that remain relevant in any society where mass communication shapes public opinion. The techniques they developed for altering human consciousness and behavior through carefully designed performances raise fundamental questions about the responsibilities that accompany the power to influence others' thoughts and actions. These moral dilemmas continue to challenge anyone who seeks to use entertainment, education, or communication to promote social change. In this quiet moment, as sleep begins to claim your thoughts and carry you toward dreams that are mercifully free from the dangers that haunted our medieval ancestors, remember that you rest in a world made possible by the sacrifices of countless forgotten heroes, whose only weapons were words, whose only shield was wit, and whose only reward was knowledge that they had spoken truth in an age when truth itself was a revolutionary act.
Sweet dreams, gentle listener, and may your rest be peaceful in the knowledge that the long night of medieval authority has given way to the dawn of human dignity that still struggles to emerge in our modern world.